As we look today at Nehemiah chapter 6, the people are so close to success. They have been working diligently. They have been overcoming various kinds of opposition. They are perhaps 85 to 90% finished with the task of rebuilding the walls. And at this point in chapter 6, we see that there is a very personal series of attacks that is lodged against Nehemiah. Sometimes you and I are involved in a project that is so physically demanding, that requires so much time and energy that it's overwhelming, and sometimes we can become discouraged by that. The people in this task, they are doing a great work, and there have been attempts to stop them. But today in chapter 6, we see not just an externally overwhelming, physically demanding job, but we see personal attacks that come against Nehemiah. We're thinking today about this thought: staying strong when others are against you. And we're going to see practical lessons of Nehemiah involved in spiritual warfare, and how he overcame that spiritual warfare, and we too can think about these principles in our own lives. In Nehemiah chapter 6, we read these beginning with verse 1. Now when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab and the rest of our enemies heard that I had built the wall, and that there was no breach left in it, although up to that time I had not set up the doors in the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, Come, and let us meet together at Hakephirim in the plain of Ono. But they intended to do me harm. And I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? And they sent to me 4 times in this way, and I answered them in the same manner. In spiritual warfare, if you are doing something good for the Lord, one of the first attacks will be the attack of distraction. In Nehemiah's situation, they faced other oppositions that we've read about, for instance, in chapter 4. They've had to take prudent action because there's the possibility that while they were literally surrounded on all 4 sides, it was the possibility that there could be spies or enemies that were infiltrating their ranks. And so they had taken actions of how to sleep, how to dress, how to divide their work, how to stay alert at all times. So they had already been facing opposition, but now there's a different personal attack, a spiritual attack against Nehemiah. These men that we've read about before, they tried to get him to leave Jerusalem, to go out to the plains of Ono, perhaps 25 miles away, about 40 kilometers away. They were going to, quote, talk with him, but he knew that this distraction, no, they actually intended to cause him harm. Time and time again, even on the smallest of levels, if we are trying to do God's work, one of the spiritual attacks that we will face is the attack of distraction. Now, this distraction is performed in a very interesting way. In those days, they would take a letter, they would most often put it in a sack, they would seal that sack, and then that package together would be sent to the person. 4 different times, this kind of letter, this sealed package, was sent to Nehemiah. On the outset, it looks fairly innocent, but he had discernment. He knew what was truly taking place. But he received this message 4 different times. This attempt to turn him away, to pull him away from the great work, on a very simple basis. Maybe you've made a commitment. Lord, I want to read my Bible every day. And Lord, starting tomorrow, the very first thing that I'm going to do tomorrow morning, I'm going to read your word, because I know that nothing strengthens me as much as your word. And then right on cue, next morning, that will be the morning that the electricity will go off in your apartment, or you'll receive a special phone call that something has happened, an emergency. And so while you're trying to do God's work, there will come a distraction. The first attack against Nehemiah is that same kind of spiritual attack. Let's distract him. Let's pull him away from the good work that he's doing. The Bible goes on and tells us, continuing with verse 5, in the same way, Sanballat for the 5th time sent his servant to me with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, "It is reported among the nations," and Geshem also says it, "that you and the Jews intend to rebel. That is why you are building the wall. And according to these reports, you wish to become their king. And you have also set up prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem, there is a king in Judah. And now the king will hear of these reports. So now come and let us take counsel together." Then I sent to him, saying, "No such things as you say have been done, for you are inventing them out of your own mind." In this second attack, in this second spiritual attack, if we cannot distract you from the work, then we will try to defame your reputation. This 5th letter, instead of being sent in a sealed envelope, in a sealed package, this was sent as an open letter. So beginning with the very person himself who was carrying this letter, he could see what was written. And he most certainly, when he saw these words, would be sharing these words with other people. And other people would also be hearing these things that are not true, but these attacks against Nehemiah's reputation, that he's trying to become a king himself, that he's trying to lead the Jews in an act of rebellion, that he's setting up prophets to proclaim good things about him. Now, Nehemiah has a letter. We've read this in the earlier chapters. Nehemiah has a letter from the true king, from Artaxerxes. And Nehemiah is there with the blessing and the protection of Artaxerxes. But other people don't know about this letter that Nehemiah has. And so now they are hearing this false news. And in fact, this false news is being spread because as it's going in this open forum, other people are hearing about it even before Nehemiah receives the message himself. The same thing happens today. We can think of many false news reports. Someone is doing something, and so they put out a false thing against that person's reputation. Unfortunately, you've perhaps faced this in your own life. You know in your heart that what you're doing is right, that what you're doing is pure, but somebody says something that goes against your own reputation. Now, the way Nehemiah handled it in this situation was very simply, he didn't spend a great amount of time trying to defend himself. He simply responded, "What you're saying is not true." And he pressed forward with the work that was taking place. He says in verse 9, "For they all wanted to frighten us, thinking, their hands will drop from the work, and it will not be done. But now, O God, strengthen my hands." There was a distraction. There was a defamation of his own reputation. But he continues to turn to God, saying, "God, give me the strength to keep going forward with this task." And he presses forward. We go on to the next verse, verse 10. "Now when I went into the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, son of Methabel, who was confined to his home, he said, 'Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. They are coming to kill you by night.' But I said, should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in." And I understood and saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced this prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this purpose he was hired, that I should be afraid and act in this way and sin, and so they could give me a bad name in order to taunt me. First, there's a distraction. Second, there's an attack, a defamation of his reputation. And now thirdly, there is an attack to spiritually disqualify him. Now, on a practical matter, Nehemiah is speaking to this person who's introduced we don't know many details about him at all, in fact, but he's presented as though he's a prophet speaking on behalf of God. But as Nehemiah is hearing what this man says, they're going to try to kill you. They're going to try to do it by night. Let's just go into the temple. On a practical matter, Nehemiah says, I can't do that. I'm the leader of these people. I've been called to this task. They are working. They are being out there. I cannot do this. I cannot just try to save my own life. But then there's also a spiritual thing. In Nehemiah's situation as a layman, he's not a prophet. He's not a priest. And in Numbers chapter 18, verse 7, there are specific instructions that a person, Nehemiah is a good person, but there are certain areas of the temple that he was not allowed to go into, and he knew that. He knew that if he went into those areas of the temple, it would be a violation against the spiritual teachings of that day. And so even though there was this fearful news given to him, he spiritually remained pure. Now, he goes on, the final verse, and says, verse 14, remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, according to these things that they did, and also the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid. He comes again back to prayer. And he says, God, these people, and again, we just know these brief things. We don't really know much about who these false prophets are. But Nehemiah knew, he discerned that they were false prophets. He knew that he was not only facing a practical challenge, he was facing ultimately a spiritual challenge. And if he went against God's teachings, then he himself would spiritually be compromised. As we think about overcoming spiritual attacks, often there is this same pattern. There is an attempt to distract you. If that does not work, there is an attempt to defame you, your reputation. And if that doesn't work, often there is the attempt to spiritually disqualify you. We see all the way back into Genesis, in fact, Adam and Eve, the very first temptations, how they went through these steps, and how Satan, the father of lies, was able to deceive them, and they ultimately transgressed God's clear teachings. And they were the first example, but we can think in our own lives, of times that we knew in our heart of hearts what God's teachings were. They were clear, they were certain, and yet we too were facing a spiritual warfare. Would we remain true to God's teachings, or would we do something that was expedient? As we think about overcoming spiritual attacks, first, we need to practice discernment. Just as Nehemiah demonstrated, we too need to have discernment. In fact, 1 John chapter 4, verse 1 tells us that we need to test the spirits because there are many false prophecies that have gone out. Second, we don't need to waste time defending ourselves. There are moments that we simply need to say, that's not true. What you're saying about me, I'm not going to overreact. I'm not going to waste a tremendous amount of time. I'm not going to be brought away from the good work that I'm doing. Yes, you're attacking my reputation, and yes, it's harmful, but God knows that I'm right, and others know that I'm right, that I'm pure. And so we see in his situation that he didn't waste time. Number three, he didn't spiritually disqualify himself for a quick solution. And when we are frightened, many times, unfortunately, we will fall into sin. The Bible says, in fact, in Proverbs chapter 28, the wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. If we maintain our spiritual integrity, it gives us the ability to be bold. On the other hand, if there is sin in our life, and we see many examples of this in the Bible, and when others confront us about that sin, it spiritually weakens our resolve. So we also need to remember to not spiritually disqualify ourselves. Number four, we need to pray for our own hearts. Now, in this situation, Nehemiah is talking about strengthening his hands. But we understand that while there's the challenge to lash out and to attack others, ultimately, we need to look at our own hearts. We need to look at our own hands. We need to look at our own actions. And we need to do what God's calling us to do. It's easy to start attacking other people and to be taken away into unfruitful areas of conduct. But again, Nehemiah demonstrates that it's his heart, it's his hands. He needs to remain focused on doing the work that God calls him to do. Number 5, don't give in to your fears. We will have fears. Time and time again, when we give in to fears, though, the results are bad. There are reasons for them to be afraid. We've talked about that in the weeks before. They have taken good, appropriate defensive actions. They've not ignored it. There's a very famous quote from a man named Franklin Roosevelt. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. So in this situation, it's not that there aren't things to be afraid of. There were things to be afraid of, and they had taken appropriate defensive actions. But the courage that is demonstrated here is that Nehemiah pushes past those fears. In this situation, the fear that his reputation is being called into context, and also the physical fear that they might in fact be coming and try to kill him by nighttime. We have to take prudent actions, but that doesn't mean that we give in to the fears. We need to move past those fears. And then number 6, in this situation, the very final verse, we've mentioned this in previous weeks, Nehemiah prays for God's punishment, not his own vengeance, not his own anger, but he turns again the situation of his enemies over to God and asks for God to do what God thinks needs to be done. As we look at this example, sometimes there are people that are attacking our very character. It's a difficult work to begin with. But in this situation, we see how Nehemiah faced these spiritual attacks and how he gave us an example that we too can follow when we ourselves face spiritual attacks in our life.